Our last speaker is Dr. Clark Pomerleau. He is an associate professor of gender and sexuality history at UNT. He was introduced to GLBT activism by his work supporting reproductive justice and women's studies. These significant fields of study, which influenced research into feminist diversity training in the 1970s and 80s, culminated in Pomerleau's book, Califia Women, Feminist Education Against Sexism, Classism, and Racism. His primary area of service focuses on education for social justice and the appreciation of diversity. And on a personal note, Dr. Pomerleau has been a dear, dear friend to the Dallas Way and a huge supporter. Please welcome Dr. Clark Pomerleau.
So first, thank you to the Dallas Way and to University of North Texas's coordinators for the chance to share with you my memories and how I connect with a history of service and activism and my work with others, many others here for LGBT acceptance in North Texas. In deference to National Coming Out Day and Robert Emery's suggestion, I'll come out a little bit. But I'm not going to tell you coming out stories, although they are a template for terrible timing and delivery. I instead am going to start with the first time someone told me about homosexuality. It was 1989, after growing up in Spokane, Washington, with zero information on variation regarding sexuality and gender. At 17, I visited family in Toronto. My uncle took me with him on an errand, and as we were walking to a shop, he said, seemingly out of nowhere, "I'm the kind of man gay men are attracted to, and if any gay man ever hit on me, I'd beat him up." Nearly simultaneously, two thoughts popped into my mind. Oh, a man could be attracted to a man. That's wrong. You don't beat someone up because they say you're attractive. But I didn't seem to generalize my uncle's professed will to violence. It just became a baseline about him from which I was very happy to notice over the next decade he became increasingly tolerant as he knew out gay coworkers. And that is indeed one aspect of that coming out process that Karen Wisely talked about. Now, I'm a historian who works with oral history and memory. So I keep returning to this recollection because it seems so factually flawed and yet so significant. How could I have known nothing about same-sex attraction in the first decade of an AIDS epidemic that was stereotyped as gay despite affecting myriad people? My parents watched the nightly news devotedly, and when I was 12, a top story was the expulsion of Ryan White from his middle school. This boy my age had been infected with HIV from blood treatments for hemophilia. And that same year, 1984, there were Spokanites with AIDS, and my mid-sized city had started their first support services. In the early 1990s, after this trip to Toronto, I found out that one of my best friends had survived our high school closeted. There was discussion about another classmate who had killed himself and whether he'd done that because he was gay. Now, my high school years had focused on courses and French club, soccer, and friends. My memory of not knowing seems like willful protective ignorance of aspects about myself that really couldn't fit into the heterosexism and homophobia and gender roles that my culture imposed. Today, I know many students my age back then were tormented for being gay, lesbian, bi, or trans in the 80s, in the 90s. But those spaces that did not mention LGBT were larger than today. And I gained from that silence at that time by having the latitude not to have to defend myself, not to stress out about aspects of who I was that I wasn't ready to deal with. Today, working with students and hearing their stories makes me wary of a progressive narrative. When people in their 40s, like I am, or older, assume that because there are more national and state protections today, there are more high school gay-straight alliances, there are more youth who come out, assume that those youth always have it so much better, I'm not sure. I know too many people in their early adulthood for whom more media discussion of LGBT didn't translate into allies in their K-12 years, who suffered physical abuse at school, who legitimately feared or experienced parent rejection. And so I've come to prioritize support for youth and young adults and other vulnerable members of our community, which maybe is a good segue into how I started a road to service and activism. My first role models were my mom and my granny. My dad also has done a lot of service for decades, but he was doing it at work, and I wasn't seeing that. My granny came from a volunteering generation and taught her art and her sewing skills to other people. She was a member of League of Women Voters and Junior League and United Nations Association. She helped with Nashville's desegregation and was in an array of less political groups. I knew my granny was so involved in Nashville's Planned Parenthood that opponents called her Ms. Planned Parent. I saw growing up my mom coordinate drivers and runners for Meals on Wheels at church. I knew she taught English as a second language and then directed that night school on a totally volunteer basis. And that night school was a space in a very, very white and very native-born city where I first got to know refugees. Work and our dinner table were my dad's liberal enclaves, but my mom, like her mother, turned to League of Women Voters and United Nations Association to find like-minded people in what was not a particularly liberal city. So my activism sprang from my family and values they placed on equal rights and providing education and service. The year that my granny's deteriorating hearing forced her to step down from 3 decades of Planned Parenthood work, I started volunteering at my local Planned Parenthood office. My second influence was women's studies. After a college life of compulsory heterosexuality and continued confusion, women's studies vastly expanded my access to accurate information, to people who promote diversity, and to activism. Women's studies graduate courses helped me disentangle sexual attraction from gender expression and identity, and recognize that I could construct my masculinity to align with feminist values. Women's studies gave me opportunities to really think consciously about what kind of man I could be. And it opened the way for a dissertation and then a book for which I interviewed mostly lesbian women about the feminist community diversity training that they had initiated in the 1970s and 80s. Those women who participated in the grassroots Califia community taught me more about feminism, anti-racism, and class bias than I could have learned solely at school. And I am so grateful to them for their continued teaching. So from this feminist background, I expanded to volunteering at Tucson's LGBT Community Center. And there a circle coalesced that responded to local attacks. I was a founding member of Lesbian Avengers in Tucson. And the Tucson chapter, they were all autonomous, was distinct from the original Northeast chapters in that it was multi-gendered and populated by members who were queer but didn't all identify as lesbian. We protested a conservative state politician who had attacked the women's studies curriculum for including queer literature. In 2000, when a man knifed a University of Arizona undergraduate on the artsy 4th Avenue that housed 2 of the gay bars. We quickly organized a protest to show community support for the victim and also to pressure the police department to investigate that as a hate crime. And on a personal level, in graduate school in Tucson, white boys in trucks slowed down to yell "fucking faggot" at me, both before and after the 1998 publicity of Matthew Shepard's abduction, torture, and murder, and the aftermath of someone in my cohort being gay bashed. So there was a solid decade during which I lived with the certainty that one day 1 or more white guys would try to kill me for being queer. And that wasn't very fun to live with. I knew in 2001 that if I was attacked, I would freeze and do nothing. And since I couldn't change the people who were committing gay bashings, and I didn't want my family to suffer losing me, I concluded I had to change myself into someone who wouldn't freeze. So I studied a defensive martial art called Aikido and gained confidence as I gained skills. And that daily fear that I had for about 10 years has dissipated for me. But I certainly remain concerned about the level of anti-queer and anti-trans violence nationwide and worldwide. So that brings me to my last part of the story, Denton. What brought me to Denton in 2007 was my goal of university teaching. Like my granny, my parents, and the Califia women, much of my service relates to education. I'm really lucky that my history specializations in gender, sexuality, and social movements are contexts from which I can redress the really terrible lack of information that I had growing up. So I use my expertise to teach college students and to lead ally trainings. For 6 years, I also supported students through advising the LGBT student group, GLAD, and other identity or topic-specific groups like Triad, and a feminist student group called FMLA. All of these are training grounds for leaders. They will probably be on that campaign for the president you're talking about. I've published on diversity education and trans-inclusive policy, but I've also been part of what has been a much larger, energetic body of people on university committees, both queer people and really great allies, who have changed policy to foster a better climate for UNT's LGBT members. And I am very proud that UNT has a history dating back the entire length of my life, a history of students, staff, and faculty championing gay and lesbian rights, developing spaces of support, and then later creating LGBT inclusive education. With supportive administration in the time I've been here, we've been institutionalizing that positive change, and I'm glad I could be one very small part of that. Like Spokane, Dentonites are responsive. 3 years ago, Denton Unitarian Universalist Fellowship initiated community discussion about what services could best meet the needs of local LGBT people outside of the universities. And I was so impressed to see over 80 people at that meeting and to feel the seriousness of those allies that I joined them. And so now I serve on the Outreach Denton Steering Committee, which oversees a totally secular community LGBT youth group and also a community-based Trans Day of Remembrance. So I'll conclude by saying that after a period when being queer made me feel so different from my family, I'm a little surprised to find that life in my 40s mirrors those first role models so much. That my vocation would be education and that I would volunteer were givens. But to have found community and love and family here in Denton, those are gifts.